Welcome to the second in this series of life lessons from Abraham. Or at this point, he's still called Abram, of course. As we looked last Sunday, you remember, at the call of Abram with the promise from God that he was going to be the father of a great nation. Now, I actually finished last week by saying that God is a miracle-working God, and that is true. Of course God's a miracle-working God, but I was getting a little ahead of myself, or actually at that point I was referencing the birth of Isaac. But there is a very important story prior to that, and we really cannot skip past that, because it's the story of Hagar and the birth of Ishmael in chapter 16. And goodness, what a sorry tale it is. Look, if we thought last week as we looked at the call of Abram that he was this model of righteousness, obediently responding to God's leading, in today's story, we really come back to earth, back to reality. Abram is really not much different from the rest of us. He begins on the right foot, following the leading of God and trusting God's promises. But look now, 10 years down the track. Of course, it's not all Abram's fault. Sarai is a major player in this saga. But note, if you will, too, that Sarai manages to play the blame game. You know what I believe, though? I believe this all started back in Egypt. If you notice in verse 1, the writer sees fit to add the detail that Hagar was from the land of Egypt. Now, this is a very important point in this story. You see, how did it happen that Sarai has a maidservant from Egypt in the first place? Now, we didn't read it last week, but following that move to Canaan, Abram took it upon himself to move to Egypt during what was a very severe famine in the land. Now, there is no reference at all in the passage to suggest that this was part of God's plan. There is no reference to God telling Abram to go there, nor to deceive the Pharaoh by suggesting, as he did, that Sarai was actually his sister. It is likely that Hagar was a gift from Pharaoh to Abram, part of a dowry for Sarai, because we read there in that passage in chapter 12, we read, "Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake and gave him sheep and oxen and camels and male and female servants." Now it seems clear to me that here we see Abram's faltering faith. Abram has taken this action both to go to Egypt and to pass off Sarai as his sister as an act of self-preservation. And as a result of that, he pays a price. And at this point, I'll give you my sentence for the week. The best place to live is in the very centre of God's will. The best place to live is in the very centre of God's will. Now, chapter 16 opens with the comment that Sarai bore Abram no children. That she is unable to carry Abram's seed, especially the inability to give birth to a male child to carry on the clan, is something of a disgrace for Sarai. So in desperation, Sarai hatches a plan. She embraces the concept that, while rather foreign to us, was perfectly legit in that culture. She offers to Abram a kind of surrogacy deal. She says, "I will give you my maidservant to sleep with so that I might have a child through her." You see, because Hagar is a property of Sarai, if Hagar conceives and produces a child, well, that child kind of also belongs to Sarai. And from Sarai's perspective, in theory, this sounds like a great idea. And maybe she even thinks this is going to strengthen her relationship with Abram. But in practice, well, we soon see what happens. And looking from a distance, none of us are surprised at what transpires, or at least we ought not to be surprised. I wonder what Abram was thinking. I wonder if he actually thought much at all. Maybe he was thinking, well, Lord, you promised to give me lots of descendants. And at Sarai's age, look, this is not looking very promising after all these years. So I'll take up this very kind offer from my beloved Sarai. From the text itself, there is no indication that Abram has grown impatient with God or that he has lost faith in God, but his willingness to accept the plan certainly suggests that he is prepared right now to step outside of God's will. Again, there is no indication in the text that Abram has either heard from God or that he even sought God's counsel when he makes this decision. He's doing this on his own bat. Now, taking Hagar might have been culturally acceptable, but it is clear from the consequences of this action that this was not a wise or a godly choice. And just because the culture around might embrace such practices, it does not mean that it's appropriate or that it's right for Abram to do likewise. And right here, I believe, is a very relevant message for Christians in the 21st century. Just because it's 2020, and we hear that said a lot, goodness, it's 2020. But just because it's 2020, and just because the prevailing culture may say that's okay, that does not automatically mean that God says it's okay. We must be careful to differentiate what is culturally acceptable and what is ordained in God's word. The word of God always trumps culture, always. Now notice something else in this story. In verse 2, Sarai says to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So go into my slave girl. You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children." Well, at around 86 years of age, that's a pretty fair assessment, maybe. It is, and I suggest this is most likely, or is it, in fact, that Sarai blames God for inability to conceive? Is she blaming God here? Is there already some animosity in Sarai's heart? Is there some tension now in the relationship between Sarai and the Lord, at least from Sarai's point of view? And might this lead then to some tension between Sarai and Abram? Yeah, I'm second guessing here, but perhaps there is some truth in it. So the Bible tells us that Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Sarai took Hagar and gave her to Abram, and Abram went into her, it says here. Well, that's a colloquial way of saying that he slept with her. And lo and behold, Hagar conceived. And she brought forth a male child, and everyone lived happily ever after. No. Certainly not. Certainly not. The text tells us that when Hagar discovered she was with child, she looked with contempt upon her mistress. She is filled with a smugness. She is filled with pride. Maybe she even held animosity against Sarai for being given into the hands of Abram. We just don't know. What the text doesn't tell us, but is self-evident, is that Sarai is consumed with jealousy and possibly feelings of inadequacy. The fact that Hagar can carry the seed of Abraham reinforces the cold, hard facts. The problem is not with Abram, but with Sarai. And this is more than Sarai can bear. And look how she handles it. Having already blamed God for her situation, now filled with this jealousy, she throws it back in the face of Abram. It is somehow totally his fault. He should not have agreed to this. What were you thinking, Abram? Let God be the judge between you and me, she says. In other words, let God decide whose actions were worse, mine for offering Hagar or yours for taking her. And here, I believe we see a real tension in the relationship. Again, I'm speculating, but when Sarai offered Abram the chance to sleep with her maidservant, did she in fact expect Abram to say, "Oh no, Sarai, I could never bring myself to do that, even with your permission. That's not what I should do"? No, probably I'm overthinking it. But I'm actually puzzled as to why she lashes out at Abram. Maybe you have the answer. I don't know whether you noticed it, but there are similarities in this story with the original fall story in Genesis chapter 3. The language is even similar. Abram listened to Sarah gave and took Hagar to give to Abram. Just as Eve listened to the serpent and took the fruit and gave it to Adam. And the consequences are similar. There is relationship breakdown, and none of us are at all surprised. I'm not sure what Sarai expected Abram to do about it, but he finds himself in a real bind, caught between a woman carrying his child and an angry and jealous wife. So Abram deals with the situation by not dealing with it, and I believe that's another mistake. He must take some responsibility. He should have found some way to resolve it, but he passes the buck. See, this righteous one is in fact far from righteous. As Hagar is the property of Sarai, Sarai is free to do with Hagar as she sees fit. So consequently, Sarai treats Hagar cruelly to the point where Hagar has had more than enough and she flees, seemingly back towards Egypt. Really, the scriptures don't tell us where she goes. But wherever she's going, she doesn't make it. As she pauses by a fresh spring, the angel of the Lord appears to her. Now, Hagar, of course, sees a person, but whenever the Hebrew scriptures speak of an angel of the Lord, we know that this is the way that they're speaking of God coming to her and speaking to her. So God appears to her and convinces her to go back and submit to her mistress. Now, that would have been a big ask, and one which I'm sure would have led to much tension. But I mean, if she's in the desert and expecting a child, perhaps it is, in her own thinking, better to be back at least in that situation where the child will have a chance. But this promise, or this message to her to go back to her mistress, actually came with a promise that her children will also be numerous. She is told the name by which her son will be called, Ishmael, meaning God hears. For the Lord heard her affliction out there in the middle of nowhere. Unfortunately, however, Ishmael will always find himself at loggerheads with others. And the chapter ends with Hagar returning to Abram and Sarai and giving birth to Ishmael. The 86-year-old Abram becomes a dad, while the 76-year-old Sarai remains childless and still filled with jealousy. And this gets borne out many years later after the birth of Isaac. So Abram now has a son. But is this the child promised? Chapter 16 leaves us hanging. But we soon learn that no, this is not God's will. And Ishmael is not the child promised, even though Abram will receive many descendants through Ishmael. Abram actually becomes the father of 2 nations. But this was not God's plan, and the consequences of their actions continue to this very day. Ishmael is recognised as the father of the Arab nations, and Islam claims him as the rightful heir to the covenant, the firstborn of Abram, the one to whom the promise of the land belongs. As a result of Sarai's scheming and Abram's willing consent to go along with a plan which was not ordained by God, as far as I can tell, we see an ongoing conflict between Muslim and Jew, between Islam and Judaism, and, of course, Christianity. And it's also been suggested that Sarai and Abram's action actually delayed the fulfilment of the promises. Some scholars believe that to be the case. Now, this story is centuries old, but in many respects it is as contemporary as tomorrow. The actions of Abram and Sarai are mirrored in contemporary society and even in our own lives, though maybe not to the same extent. It's very easy to get caught up in things, in actions that are not of God. And when we do that, we suffer the consequences. And as Paul says in Galatians, God cannot be mocked. We reap what we sow. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 8, we read, If you sow in your own flesh, you will reap corruption from the flesh. But if you sow to the Spirit, you will reap eternal life from the Spirit. How many times do we make decisions without even consulting the Lord? Is this your will, Lord? Am I doing this for you, or is this simply to fulfill my selfish ambitions and desires? Am I honouring you with what I plan? Am I serving you or serving my own aspirations? We ought to be asking these kind of questions about every matter, not just about the ministry to which we're all called, but also to those day-to-day decisions about our lives. There really is no better place to live than in the centre of God's will. That's what we were created for. To move outside of God's will ultimately lead to trouble and to turmoil and to conflict and despair and even hopelessness. In this story, we also see the exploitation of Hagar, who has no choice but to obey the one who has power over her. There is no indication in the text that Hagar was a willing participant in this, and nor should we expect her to be. Remember, after all, Abram is an old man and hardly someone to excite the young maidservant Hagar. We see that God cares for the downtrodden and exploited Hagar. Such is Hagar's response to this, that as well as agreeing to the name Ishmael for her child, God has heard, she gives the Lord a name, El Roi, the God who sees. For you see, even out in the desert, God sees her. God came to her and God cared for her. You know, even in the mess of this whole saga, we see the grace of God at work. Our actions can lead to disastrous consequences, some of which we cannot undo. But even in these situations, God can still work out his purposes, even if it takes a little longer, even if it doesn't go quite as it may have been planned. But still, remember this, there is no better place to live than in the very centre of God's will. So let me leave you this morning with a verse from Proverbs, that fount of all wisdom. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 says to us, it's a well-known verse, trust in the Lord. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. May God bless you and lead you as you seek to faithfully follow him, to live in that very centre of his good and perfect will. Amen.